Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Genesis chapters 1 through 4 as we give our class on Old Testament literature and theology. We're beginning this section now of the Torah, also known as the Pentateuch. The word Torah means either law or instruction. The word Pentateuch, actually, it's a Greek term, means the five-part book. And so we refer to the books of Genesis all the way down to Deuteronomy when we talk about either one of these. Genesis is going to, and that's where we're starting. Genesis is going to give us the story beginning with creation, and we'll have four major events, and then we're going to have four major people: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So creation all the way to the point where the Israelites enter into Egypt, and that's where it will end. Exodus will pick up in Egypt, and it's going to talk about the deliverance from Egypt, and then the Israelites will go out into the wilderness. They'll go down to Mount Sinai. They'll get the law, the establishment of the covenant, the instructions on how to build the tabernacle, and they will build it, and God will enter the tent, and that's where Exodus will end. Leviticus picks up there at the tabernacle by by Mount Sinai, and it's giving the laws of worship. What do we do with the tabernacle now that we have it? Numbers picks up, they're still there by Sinai at the beginning, and they're going to try to go into the promised land, but they will fail. So this will be the wilderness wanderings, spending 40 years in the wilderness. That's the book of Numbers. And the book of Numbers ends, they're still in the wilderness, and now Deuteronomy picks up with the law being given to a new generation because the old generation had died into the wilderness. The new generation gets the law with special emphasis to those who are entering the promised land. So that's where we're headed in the next five books, but we're starting right now with Genesis. Now, it was noticed early on that as you start in Genesis chapter 1, you have God described. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and the word for God is Elohim. But you get to chapter 2, and instead of God being referred to Elohim, there's an addition of a name. Now, notice I wrote here Jehovah. That's an anglicized version. Hebrew doesn't have the letter J, so they wouldn't pronounce it that way. Perhaps they would go Yahweh, but I'm just writing here Jehovah for the time being. And it's not that Elohim is forgotten. In fact, he's called Jehovah Elohim all throughout chapter 2 and 3. And it seems to go back and forth between those two names throughout Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers. You get to Deuteronomy, that changes. And a scholar back in the 1700s by the name of Jean Astruc, he suggested that maybe Moses was utilizing two different source documents as he brought that about. I used to think, maybe that's right. Now, I guess there's still possibilities of that, but I've come to think differently now, and I'll explain why in just a bit. Well, there was nothing wrong with that theory. It was just a theory that was out there. But then William DeWitt looked at that and he said, "Well, Deuteronomy doesn't doesn't fit into that theory at all. So that must have been penned by some other author." Um, and notice, Ostruck had been saying Moses utilized two different source documents. DeWitt isn't necessarily saying Moses did it, but whoever wrote that, and then Deuteronomy is still a different author. Next, we have Hulfeld, who's going to try to subdivide Elohim into what he calls E1 and E2, and people like to take a theory and take it to the next level. But notice this theory was starting to be commonly accepted, at least by some. And in the 1800s, following in the footsteps of Charles Darwin, who tried to give a reasoned view of how life came about in all of its complexity based on evolution, based on just chance happenings, Julius Wellhausen tries to do something similar with the books of the Pentateuch. And so he comes up with a theory saying that first there was the J writer, the Jehovah writer, and he lived maybe around the time of David or maybe a little bit afterwards. And then a bit after that, you have the Elohim writer. Again, none of these have anything to do with Moses. In fact, he would have said Moses is sort of a mythological figure. Then you have the Elohim writer, the one who writes those portions that are that use the word Elohim. Sometimes it uses Jehovah Elohim. In fact, it commonly does that. So you've got the Jehovah part has sometimes Jehovah Elohim, but now just the strictly Elohim writer. And then you had, remember Deuteronomy, they said that doesn't fit into that. So now you have whoever wrote Deuteronomy, and that is said to be by Wellhausen in Josiah's day, around the 600 BC. And then after the Babylonian captivity, he reasoned that now you finally have the priestly writer, and he comes along afterwards. And so somebody came along and took all these portions and just threw them all together, and out came Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, that theory, the legs were really sort of cut off of that back in, I'd say, back in the 1950s or 60s. But it has continued to be taught in a number of liberal universities, although even those are starting to turn their back on this documentary hypothesis. Sometimes we call it the JEDP theory. That's a bit of a mouthful. Especially when they noted that you have structures like almost like an intricate puzzle. We're going to see how these work. Binding across these, these supposed authors, it blows the theory completely away. So imagine having a jigsaw puzzle, and your theory is that the puzzle pieces just sort of developed over a number of years, and you say, wait a minute, take a look at the picture. That wasn't an afterthought. The picture of the jigsaw puzzle. And what they hadn't done, they hadn't taken a good look at the picture of it and the structures that are found, the specifically chiastic structures and the literary structures that are found in those books. And when they found that, when they began to see these, and folks have seen that, both Christians and non-Christians alike, they said, well, that just doesn't do justice to the documentary hypothesis. And so that theory, and sometimes you'll still see people that are espousing it and using it that don't know any better. But it has fallen largely out of favor, not just among evangelical Christians, but even among those that are not. Now, with that, let's start then into the book of Genesis, the book of beginnings, because we're going to have a lot of things that begin in this book, not just the heavens and the earth, but also nations and the family of Abraham, and the covenant ideas that we see throughout the Bible are all going to have their beginnings right here. Genesis chapters 1 through 11 are going to describe four major events. Now, I'm painting very broadly here, but we'll do this anyway. We'll have the creation in the first two chapters, and then what we traditionally call the fall, although Genesis isn't going to describe it in those terms, but the fall into sin, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. So four major events, and then chapters 12 through 50, which, notice, that's the bulk of the book. You've got only 11 chapters in the first half, and then a great deal more material given in the second half, where you're going to have four people. Abraham, Isaac is mentioned, and I put his name here, but he's not mentioned as prominently. And he's usually involved in somebody else's story. Either he's being described in his relationship with Abraham or as the father of Jacob and Esau. But I'll put his name in here anyway. So you've got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and of course Jacob has 12 sons, but the one about whom we read the most will be Joseph. And so I put his name as well. And in the first half, we had the human race as a whole. Now, sometimes the human race was only a couple of people, like in the creation and in the fall. But then, as we get to Genesis chapter 12, and actually introduced at the latter part of Genesis chapter 11, we're going to see one family, the family of Abraham. And so that's going to be in view. Genesis chapters 1 through 11, well over 2,000 years. That's just if we take all those numbers, the begats, so-and-so was so many years old when he begat his son. If we take those literally, and I'm not sure we're supposed to, but if we do, then we've got over 2,000 years of history. A lot less when we come to the family of Abraham. If we just, like the sum total family of Abraham, 4 generations, around 250 years, and that's stretching it. A lot less time, but a lot more material is given. So that's going to be where our focus will be. We're going to treat Genesis 1 through 11 more as introductory material. It's important, but it's introductory material in Genesis to get to the main idea of God working in the lives of this family. So Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 starts off, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, that word God, I already mentioned, that's the Hebrew word Elohim. Notice that im is masculine plural. In Hebrew, you have, in English, you go singular and plural. In Hebrew, you go singular dual. You don't always have to use the dual, but you can, and then plural. So plural would be more than one, but also could be more, more than two. Um, and so that im is masculine plural, and people have wondered, does that mean we have the Trinity there? I don't think that we do. I don't think that's the case. Instead, if you ask Jewish scholars, they'll typically say, and I think they might be right, that this is what's called the plural of majesty. You see, El is the word for God, but Elohim is that plural sense. And when you want to describe something as really big, then you describe it in either the dual or the plural. For example, the word heavens is uh, shamayim is the word for heavens. You say the heavens, you say ha shamayim. The ha part is the word, the definite article. And but you can't say it in the singular. The word doesn't appear in the singular; it's always in the dual. And there's just words that are like that. Now, you can't say El, you can't say God in the singular. But most often, throughout most of the Hebrew scriptures, you're going to find it in the plural here, in Elohim. That will be the full form of the word. And notice he creates the heavens and the earth, uh, sort of the up there places and the down here places, because they hadn't seen like a map or a picture of a globe or something like that. So this is basic farmer's language, and that's how it's being described. So the heavens and the earth, and then verse 2 goes on, and the earth was unformed and unfilled, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Notice, as the description goes on, you find out that yes, the heavens and the earth were created, but they weren't quite finished yet, weren't quite finished cooking. So they were unformed and unfilled. And that actually sets up the rest of the chapter, because the rest of the chapter is going to talk about the earth being formed and filled. You look at it this way, day one, we're going to have a division between light and the darkness. God says, let there be light, and there was light, and God thought it was good, and then he divides the light from the darkness, and that becomes day one. Next, on day two, you have a division between the water and the sky. We already had water mentioned in verse 2, but now the waters which were under the my old English translation says firmament. I think newer translations maybe say expanse. Either one works. Um, but the waters that are down here are divided from the waters that are up there. You say, what waters are up there? Well, you know how it rains, and water up there comes down here. So again, very basic, a division. And then on day three, we have a division of the dry land from the the part that's the water, and we also have vegetation. So these things are being formed on day one, day two, day three. I come to day four, and I'd had light and darkness divided, light divided from the darkness on day one. Now the things that go in the light and the darkness, that is light bearers, the sun, the moon, the stars are mentioned. Oh yeah, them too. But it's not called the sun and the moon. It's called the greater light and the lesser light. You know what it is. And perhaps one of the reasons for that is because the word for sun, shamash, the word shamash is the Hebrew word for sun. That's also the word for a pagan deity. And so the writer doesn't want to leave any confusion thinking that God maybe made these pagan deities. No, 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 no. We're just talking about the greater light and the lesser light. And so it's explained that way. And so you have it filled with the sun and the moon and the stars. And then on day 5, you have the water and the sky filled with fish in the water, and birds fill the sky. And then on day 6, the dry land is filled with land animals and also mankind. Mankind is created on day 6. And then you turn the page to chapter 2, and you see the Sabbath rest, which thematically looks like it goes here. In fact, when I was younger, I used to actually say this, that The first three verses of chapter 2 really should have been chapter 1. They just had a bad place for the chapter division. I was wrong. And I'll explain why when we get there in a bit. But first, we want to look at a couple of other things here in chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So we see that, and notice the plural again. Now, this time, this is actually going to be rather unusual, where the plural pronoun is used both here, and we're going to see it again at the end of Genesis chapter 3. And we'll see it a third time in Genesis chapter 11 when God is dealing with the Tower of Babel. You say, well, certainly this ought to be seen as the Trinity. And again, I'm not sure that it is. I think maybe this also is that plural of majesty that we mentioned. There are some other examples where the same sort of thing is used, not referencing God, but just referencing something that's important. Maybe actually at one point the owner of an oxen, or in Ezra the Persian king says, we're going to make that decision. You say, well, wait a second. I thought you were the king. I thought you made all the decisions. But that plural of majesty is used there too. So I think that's probably what's happening here as well. The Jews didn't look at this and just assume, oh, God must exist in some sort of plurality. Let me say, I am a Trinitarian, but I don't get it from here because the New Testament doesn't point to this and use this as a evidence for Trinitarianism. I think there's other evidences instead. Well, notice verse 27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And this brings up the question, in what way is man or mankind, because notice this is, notice man is made both male and female, so it's not just talking about man in gender-wise, but mankind is made both male and female. But in what way is mankind made in the image of God? And a lot of different theories have been set forth, and probably there are a few different ways. But the way that Genesis chapter 1 describes him as being made in the image of God is seen in the next verse. We come to verse 28. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. And here it is, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So mankind is set up as the crown of creation to rule over the fish, the birds, every living thing that moves. And so he rules, I would say, as God's deputy, that mankind has been deputized to take the role of God and rule over his creation, not in a way that destroys that creation, but in a way that takes care of it, that he has been entrusted with creation from God, and now he is to act as God's official representative. So that Genesis chapter 1, we see the heavens and the earth are created in 6 days. As we turn now to chapter 2, we're going to see creation of the man and the woman again being described, but no time element's going to be mentioned. So this is I could call this a second creation account, a second telling of the story, but from a different perspective, from the man-woman perspective, instead of from the cosmic perspective. So chapter 1, the climactic moment comes when God creates mankind. He makes them male and female. In Genesis chapter 2, the climactic, not the pivotal, that's going to be something else, but the climactic moment comes when God makes the woman and brings her to the man. That's what the story is leading up to. And so we start off in chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, where creation has been completed. The heavens and the earth have been created, and God finishes his work, and he rests on the Sabbath. And actually, we have a few verses given over to the Sabbath and what it entails. 6 days you will work, and on the seventh you'll rest. So that creation ordinance, that Sabbath rest ordinance is made. And then in verses 4 through 9, this is all Genesis chapter 2, man is created. Now, when I say man, I'm talking about male instead of female. He's formed from the dust of the ground, and that's going to become very clear a few verses later. He's formed from the dust of the ground, and God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, although the Hebrew is lives. Remember how the plural, you wanted to describe something especially significant, you make it plural. That's not saying he has multiple lives. It's not like a cat with 9 lives. It's just the way that it's described. It's the way the term is used. And then we have trees and rivers in the garden that are given names. There's 2 trees, the tree of life and also the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then we have rivers as well. Now, let's look at a map because 2 of these rivers are familiar to us. Now, the first 2 rivers, we have a little bit of a difficulty trying to figure out exactly where they're located. But then the Tigris, and it doesn't use that term, it uses the Hebrew term Hiddekel, but Tigris is the name we know it by, so that's what I'm going with. And the Euphrates, and we're very familiar with those 2 rivers. And because of that, people have looked at this idea of Eden and thought, well, maybe where the rivers come together before they flow into the Persian Gulf, that's sort of become the traditional place where most people look to where Eden was located. Now, notice on this map, the headwaters of the rivers don't seem to be very close. Although, if we traced out the smaller streams, they really would be because both of them are in that triangle area by those three mountain lakes. And it might be in that area where we're supposed to think of as Eden. On the other hand, if I ask a Jewish rabbi, where was Eden? He might be inclined to say, oh, Eden, that was located where Jerusalem is today. That's their tradition. I'm just going to leave it as a big question mark. Now, if we're talking a global flood, and not everyone agrees with that, and we'll talk about that in the next class. But if we're talking about a global flood, then it could be that the rivers names that we have today are named after rivers that maybe looked very differently and flowed differently in a world before the flood. Again, that's all speculation. So we pick up again with our outline of Genesis chapter 2. Notice the rivers and the trees were in the garden were given names, and then the man is assigned the task of guarding and keeping the garden. And you say, guarding the garden, is he guarding it from something? And maybe there's a little bit of a hint that there's something to be guarded against. I should say this: when you describe a garden in the ancient world, there's plants in the garden. That's part of what makes it a garden. But the other thing that makes it a garden is that it's walled off. It's sectioned off from the outer world. So that when you have a garden, there's always an entrance to a garden. And we're going to see that here in this story, but also think about the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus is there at a place called Gethsemane. Now, the New Testament doesn't specifically call it the Garden of Gethsemane. It just says there's a garden and then says the place was called Gethsemane. So we usually put that together. But John chapter 19 actually John chapter 18 actually talks about Jesus going out to the entrance of the garden, which again indicates there was an entrance and a wall around it. So just think about this when we get to chapter 3. We'll get there in a second. The pivotal point of chapter 2 is where God gives the stipulation regarding the forbidden fruit. Here it is. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may eat freely. And there were a lot of trees in the garden, but notice that even included the tree of life. Verse 17, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it, you shall surely die. Now, the Hebrew there, when it says you shall surely die, if you wanted to be overly literal, you would say, die and you will die. And when I was younger, I remember somebody told me, well, that's 2 deaths. That's like a physical death and a spiritual death. No, 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 no. The person that told me that didn't know Hebrew very well. Actually, what that is, it's a Hebrewism to say you're really going to die. So when they translate it, you shall certainly die or you shall surely die, that's correct. What you do is you say it twice, and that emphasizes it in Hebrew. So you shall certainly die. And notice, you'll die on the day that you eat from it, not 900 years later, not eventually. So the prophecy is very specific. Now, That was the pivotal point. Next, we have, notice, back in verse 15, we had man assigned the task of gardening and keeping the garden. And now we find out that in that work, man is in need of a helper. It's not good for him to be alone. And so God determines to make a helper fitted for him. But before he does that, he brings the animals about, and the animals in the garden are given names in the same way the trees and the rivers had been given names back in verses 9 through 14. So I want you to see the symmetry of the story. And only after that is man taken, and he is put to sleep, and from his side is brought the woman. And the woman is created, and she's formed from his rib, and she is brought to the man, and everything is good, and everything is wonderful. And we read that the man and the woman are naked and unashamed, and everything's good. So notice the entire chapter works together in this beautiful symmetry, and I want you to catch the symmetry. This type of symmetry is known. Here's the technical term for it. It's called a chiasm. CHIASM. Sorry about that. I probably should have written it on here somewhere. Now we come to chapter 3, and it's introduced with a serpent. And it's what's funny is that the Hebrew word for naked, they were naked and unashamed, and then the Hebrew word for serpent actually sound a lot alike. They're different words, but they it's almost like a rhyme. And I'm not sure if there's anything significant there, maybe just happenstance. But the serpent comes and questions the woman and says, "Has God really said you can't eat from every tree of the garden?" And she just is willing to engage with that, and she says, "Oh, we can eat from, but we can't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Neither shall we touch it." Now that hadn't been said before, and I used to think, "Oh my goodness, Eve added to the Word of God," but maybe not, because what happens oftentimes is when you're telling a story and then somebody else is coming along and retelling it, that new details are added, not that they weren't there the first time, but they weren't given the first time. So I'm going to give Eve the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it's not a case of her adding to the Word of God. Maybe we're just finding out that God had said, don't even touch it. That's entirely possible. And so, verse 6, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. And that might mean that he was with her all the way up through the temptation. Or maybe he just comes along now and he's with her, and so she gives him and he eats. As soon as they eat, the eyes of them both are opened, and they realize they're naked, and they try to hide themselves, and they try to do this fig leaf thing. By the way, there's something really humorous about that. Um, if you look up, you can actually Google fig leaves, and fig leaves are fine, but if you take them off their branch, they produce a sap that is a little like poison ivy. So I can't help but wonder, a bad idea to use fig leaves pulled off the branches of a tree and put it close to your skin. I can't help but wonder what were the natural reactions to that. And the Israelites, I think, reading this might know that, and they probably got a good chuckle over that. But most of us don't realize that. Now, the big question comes up when they ate from the fruit, their eyes were open, but we have to ask the question, why didn't they die? Because the promise had been not just that you're going to die, but on the day that you eat from it, you will certainly die. Die and you will die. It's really going to happen. It's certain. And so we have to ask, why didn't they die? When I was younger, if you'd asked me this, I might have thought, well, they did die spiritually, and they were separated from God, and that sort of death. But I think that's not accurate. Now, let me say, I think they did die spiritually, but that's not the answer, because the prophecy had been given here in this book, and there's no reference anywhere in Genesis or Exodus or Leviticus, or let me just say, there's no reference in the Old Testament to spiritual death. Now, it's real. It's described in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 1. We were dead in our trespasses and sins. I'm not saying that didn't happen, but that hadn't been revealed yet. And I think that there's an answer in this chapter as to why they did not die. And that comes up at the end of the chapter when God shows up and he has passed judgment, and then he made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. And the Jewish reader would hear this and would think, oh, this was a sacrifice. They would put that together. That this involved the sacrifice of an animal, an innocent substitute that died in their place, picturing the way we would have ultimately one who died in our place to remove our condition. And so I think the story fits together when we realize this sacrificial idea that's here. But sure enough, God shows up, and when he does, he has words with both the man, the woman, and the serpent, and then he turns to the serpent and he says, "I will put enmity between you," this is the serpent here, "between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He, that is her seed, shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel." Now, notice what hasn't been mentioned. What hasn't been mentioned in this chapter is the person of Satan. I'm not saying he wasn't there. I think he was, but I don't find that out until later on in the New Testament. Right here, it's just the serpent. But this idea of the seeds, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, that's going to run us through the rest of the Bible and through the rest of Genesis. I have two seeds, therefore, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And ultimately, when I get to the New Testament, I find that the seed of the serpent is a reference to Satan. He's not mentioned here in Genesis chapter 3. It's just the serpent. But seeing it from a New Testament perspective, I can see that Satan is the ultimate fulfillment of this. In fact, Revelation is going to talk about that old serpent, the devil, and that's what it's pointing to. Revelation chapter 12. And then ultimately, the seed of the woman is going to be referencing Jesus Christ. And you say, well, who's the woman here? Is it Eve or is it Mary? And in the context of Genesis chapter 3, it's Eve. Mary hadn't been born yet. But from the holistic perspective, both could be good, both could fit in the fact that Jesus is born without an earthly father. And yet he goes to the cross. And when he goes to the cross, that is a defeat for the serpent. That is a defeat for Satan, where his head is bruised on the cross. The image is as though a man sees a snake and he takes his foot and stomps on the head of the snake and kills it, but then in the process is bitten on his heel. So notice the head of the serpent, Satan's head, Satan suffered a defeat on the cross because his work was overturned. And yet at the same time, the heel of Jesus was symbolically and maybe even literally, because the way they crucified people, at least at certain times, was by putting a heel not from the top of the foot, but through actually the heel. So maybe this was more literal than I usually think, but at least symbolically, his heel is bruised upon the cross, where his humanity, he dies but then rises again. And so this is the beginnings of a prophecy that will eventually be culminated in the cross of Christ. But in the meantime, and that's what I want to catch, in the meantime, that hadn't yet been revealed. And so what I'm going to have, notice the fatal wound of Satan, the human wound, but a human wound where there's a resurrection in the case of Jesus. And yet in the context of Genesis, I'm going to get into chapter 4 and I will see the woman giving birth to two sons, to two seeds, Cain and Abel. But we will not go very far before we see Cain, even though he's physically descended from the woman, in a more spiritual sense, he's like he was the seed of the serpent. And so there's a contrast here. Adam and Eve were warned by God. In the Cain and Abel story, Cain is warned by God. In the Adam and Eve story, they ate the forbidden fruit. In the Cain and Abel story, Cain murders his brother. In the Adam and Eve story, he's questioned by God. Cain is questioned by God. In the Adam and Eve story, they are banished from the garden. Like I said, there's an entryway to the garden, and they're cast out, and a cherub with a flaming sword is placed at the entryway to keep them out. They're banished from the garden, and Cain is banished from the area. He has to go and be a wanderer somewhere. And so the stories are in parallel. And what it's showing us is that Cain spiritually, not physically, but spiritually, he's acting the part of the serpent. He's sort of picking up the mantle of the serpent, and he goes forth with his wife. And you say, where did he get his wife? Well, Genesis chapter 5 is going to tell us that Adam and Eve had a number of sons and daughters. So I think that's where one of those daughters becomes his wife. But he starts a new line, and you go 7 generations where there's a whole genealogy there, and you get down to Lamech, the 7th generation down from Cain, who murders someone, who kills a man, and then writes a song to brag or taunt, or it's not like I'm sorry I did that. It's like, good for me. God was going to watch out for Cain. Lamech is going to talk. He's going to watch out for Lamech. I'm gonna watch out for myself. And it's a very proud, boastful song. And then we come to chapter 5, but a little before we do that, chapter 4, verse 25, where we read, Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. The word Seth means appointed. For she said, God has Seth me, she has appointed me another offspring. And the term offspring, literally, another seed. And so you have to catch this seed idea in place of Abel, for Cain killed him. And so the seed theme runs through Genesis chapters 3 and 4 and 5. Actually, I think it started all the way back in chapter 1. And in chapter 5, we have Enoch is given next. Now it's through Seth, not through Cain and Abel. But you go down 7 generations and you find Enoch, 7 generations to Lamech. By contrast, you go 7 generations to Enoch. Instead of killing somebody, he walks with God. And then after him, you get to Noah. And we'll pick up next time with Noah, how that seed of the woman and that promise and that God working through with his people and through his people will continue throughout the rest of the book of Genesis.